to the What If It's Not Depression Vodcast. I'm Dr. Achina Stein. I'm interviewing Dr. Beverley Rider. She's a former biotech scientist turned functional nutritionist and histamine whisperer. And she is on a mission to help women calm these histamine reactions without further restricting their lives. She got her PhD in microbiology and immunology and worked in biotech for over 10 years until she started having strange immune reactions that she couldn't figure out. She did a deep dive into everything histamine and had some amazing results. She has written a book called Hives, Headache, and Heartburn: Heal Your Histamine Hangover. Welcome, Dr. Beverley Rider.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. It's such a pleasure to be here today and such an honor. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I have come upon issues with histamines myself, and we talked a little bit about that and how that might actually be connected to eczema, which was really informative. You've taught me so many things already, and I would love for you to share with the audience how much histamines can actually cause depression and anxiety. It's one of the root causes that are actually missed by a lot of functional medicine providers as well, because it's so hard to nail down. People have different presentations of a histamine reaction. And sometimes they can be really obvious, like migraines and skin rashes, but sometimes it's not so obvious. And it's a matter of having a pretty high index of suspicion about, ooh, maybe it's histamines, right? And so I would love for you to dump your brain into this podcast and let us know more about histamines. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit about yourself first and tell us how you got even into all of this, everything histamines.
Sure, thank you. Well, it's been a lifelong struggle with histamine, and even as a child, I would have fainting episodes. When I got too hot, I would get sunstroke, had strange rashes, a lot of inflammatory signs and symptoms, but never put it together until after my daughter was born. And when she was 6 days old, in the middle of the night, she woke up and she couldn't breathe. And she was thrashing. She was in a co-sleeper. And I woke up and I felt this moving around. Her eyes were wide and her airway was blocked. And so I immediately called 911. They came. They couldn't get her breathing again, but managed to get a little bit of oxygen passed. We went to ER, and the doctors didn't have answers, but she did better. She recovered. But since then, it's been a deep dive into what happened. How are we never going to have this happen again? And it was the scariest night of my life.
Wow.
And she continued to have reactions for the next 2.5 years, including head to toe hives. And I have some of those photos in the book. And we couldn't put it together because all her allergy tests came back negative. She wasn't fully allergic to anything. It didn't make sense. And as an immunologist with all this traditional immunology, years and years, how could I not put this together? Where have I gone wrong with this is happening to my own daughter, this immune issue? So I did a deep dive. Then the histamine just started to make sense. This histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome, which I will talk about later. Mm-hmm. And as I was uncovering all this fascinating information, I thought, wait, this is what's been happening to me. This is why I'm getting these rashes. This is why if I stay up late, I'm completely stressed, I'm eating leftovers, I'm doing this, trying to be healthy, and but just having a meltdown and just feeling terrible, waking up in the morning like I've really hungover, but I haven't had alcohol. I feel like I've been out all night drinking. I'm puffy, I'm exhausted, I'm achy, and sniffles, congestion, headache, migraines. So it started to all come together. But was there a big aha moment? Not really. There were a lot of little small aha moments along the way. But a big one for me was anxiety. I was a type of person that I would go catch snakes as a little girl or climb trees and just go out and not think twice about jumping in. But suddenly I started feeling all this anxiety where I almost couldn't breathe. And it would cause probably a little bit too TMI, but I would have to run to the bathroom way too many times and have to leave
Mm,
school maybe 15 times just before a public talk. And this wasn't me. So I knew something was amiss.
mm.
So that's a little bit of my background.
Wow. Wow. So then, so it started, you knew that it started in childhood, but
Mhm.
you didn't really pick it up until how many years ago?
I would say the histamine intolerance probably about 10 years ago.
10 years.
And it was after I read Dr. Afrin's book called Never Bet Against Ockham, where he really goes into mast cell things. And this is a little bit probably heavy duty, so I'll just back out and say there were a lot of things that came together. And the mast cell part I put together after seeing a functional doctor and speaking with her and going through a few things and testing. And so she said there was mast cell activation syndrome. And
Mm,
that's relevant because mast cells are those immune cells that are on the first line of defense. They're loaded with histamine. They're ready to release it when they see danger. And to them, they don't know the difference between stress is danger or an immune or an infection or something. So they can release histamine if you're too stressed.
right.
And that was a big aha moment for me where the stress would release this histamine that goes into my blood vessels. And then to counteract that, your body releases other things to try to mitigate those things. And that can cause anxiety. So
Right.
that's a
Right.
real big trigger.
Yeah. So yeah, you had anxiety, but we also know that it causes depression,
Mm-hmm.
significant depression, right? And there was a recent study that came out in 2019 about that study. Why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. They took adolescents who were having their first episode, depressive episode, and they wanted to see is there anything in the blood that they could measure to either as a test for early risk factors or just to help as a therapeutic measure. So they tested histamine, they tested a lot of other markers, and they found that there was elevated histamine significantly across all these depressed adolescents. And this is pretty is pretty exciting because this also gives us a therapeutic target. Would you feel better if you lowered that histamine? And so it's a big deal. And histamine has a it's actually a neurotransmitter, as you know, and
Right.
a big role in mood. And one of the first things I notice in myself is when I'm having a reaction, I get a little irritable.
Mhm. Right. Right, absolutely, and but it can really cause rage reactions, significant depressions, as well as severe anxiety to the point of panic attacks. So why don't we back up and tell us about histamine intolerance, and then we'll get into some of the rest of the things because I'm so excited. I just want to like jump in and get as much information from you, and I'm like getting ahead of myself. So let's start with histamine intolerance.
Sure. Well, histamine, actually, believe it or not, was discovered over 100 years ago. And we all make histamine and we all consume histamine. It's all around us. We can't get rid of it. Um, and it's a mighty small little chemical messenger. It's very important for many, many things. And although it gets a really bad rap for its involvement in allergy, it's actually essential for survival, um, including for digestion. It helps stimulate stomach acid. And I just had breakfast, so I have histamine helping me digest right now. And it actually works as a neurotransmitter. And in fact, I'm using it now to focus on this talk.
Mhm.
And works as the immune system. It's very key. It's one of the very first dominoes in a long cascade of immune response, including inflammation. So I'm healthy because histamine is protecting me from my environment.
Right.
But
So
where's many?
so not all histamine is bad. Some histamine's good, and you want to have a balance.
Exactly. It's the most repurposed molecule I've ever seen.
Mm,
So when it builds up above our ability to break it down, that's when you get the histamine intolerance and when you get signs and symptoms.
Yeah, so when you have this histamine intolerance, we are looking at sometimes people have high levels of histamines and we want to bring it back into balance. And some of the ways that this happens is because there are multiple histamine receptors that can get hit. And sometimes like I said, some people have obvious histamine reactions like allergies and nasal congestion and runny nose and eyes tearing. But some symptoms aren't so obvious because other histamine receptors are potentially being hit as well. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. Well, you're right. There are a wide range of symptoms, such as the allergy symptoms, but also the gut symptoms, such as when you eat, you could have belching, bloating, reflux, abdominal pain, diarrhea. Heartburn is a big one too. And we know that histamine is involved because if we use an acid blocker, such as the H2 blocker Pepcid or Tagamet, or the one that's been discontinued now, Zantac,
Mm-hmm.
these actually work through the second histamine receptor, the H2 receptor. And so we know that these are histamine symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
So we have symptoms of the skin, such as the itch and flushing when your faces turn red, also eczema, rosacea, and often the puffiness. As a child, I often had this big puffy face. And that makes sense because mast cells that are filled with histamine are in the connective tissue in the interstitial space,
Mm-hmm.
and they are leaking out, or they're causing the leaking out of fluids. So you get this puffiness, and often I would wake up really puffy,
Mm-hmm.
and just like kind of like the lymphatic massage to get rid of it.
Right.
That's a big clue.
How about
And
puffy eyes too? Puffiness
absolutely,
around the eyes. Yeah.
absolutely, yeah, could be swelling, swelling of the throat, fatigue, dizziness and vertigo. Migraines is something that I've struggled with for a long time. They're much better now.
Mm-hmm.
Brain fog is one of the worst because I just did not being able to put sentences together in the brain fog. Anxiety, depression, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
menstrual related issues because histamine triggers estrogen and estrogen triggers histamine. They don't play nice together.
Mm.
Insomnia, because histamine actually spikes in the middle of the night, so it can wake you up. A
Mm.
big one, probably the most useful one in terms of testing for histamine, is if you take your skin and you just scratch it. Don't draw blood, just
Mhm.
scratch it. And
Right.
if you have redness and erased and irritated skin that persists for a long time, that's called dermatographism, and it's also a sign of too much histamine.
Mm. That's very specific for a certain histamine receptor, correct?
You do have histamine receptors H1 and H4 in your skin, yes. But I
Mhm.
think if you just have mast cell activation or histamine in general, it can come up. In fact, Dr. Ben Lynch, who has histamine intolerance, he used to do this before he would go out on a boat because he wanted to see if he was going to get seasick.
Ah,
Seasickness is one of the symptoms of histamine being too high. And
ah.
so he would scratch his skin to see if he would be high histamine and going to throw up. And so he talks about that in one of his videos.
Huh. That's a really nice tidbit. Yeah. But not everybody has that kind of reaction in their skin.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. Sometimes,
So yeah, there's so like because it's that's what makes it so hard to actually diagnose as histamine intolerance being a factor. So what causes excess histamine?
well, there are actually a lot of causes, and um, in fact, I go through these causes because my boot camp is cause-based healing. So the
Hmm.
healing is based on the different causes, but there's so many that I take 4 weeks and I barely scratch the surface. But
Oh wow.
there's three categories. There's too much histamine coming in, for example, in a high histamine food,
Right.
too little histamine going out, usually depending on, usually related to low levels of histamine degrading enzymes like DAO is a big
Right.
one in the gut.
There's another one,
Yeah,
HNMT.
correct. Yes, that's another one. There's actually more. There's NAT2 is a minor one, but there are others. And then there are complex. The third category is complex causes such as coming from inside us, like mast cell activation syndrome or estrogen, like I mentioned, the vicious cycle of estrogen increasing histamine and vice versa.
Hmm.
Ultimately, it's usually a combination for many people.
Right. Yeah. And so it is eating foods that are high in histamine that can cause excess histamine, but also not being able to digest and eliminate histamines from the body, as we mentioned. What are some of the foods that are high in histamine?
Yeah, well, if you think of it as the bacteria can produce histamine, that
Hmm.
whenever bacteria has the chance to grow on food, such as with leftovers or
Hmm.
things like meat or fish that haven't been stored properly and that start to degrade, as well as things that are aged or fermented,
Hmm.
cured, and things like that.
Yeah.
So there's different.
Avocados are really high in histamine, and it's such a great healthy food to have. Sometimes when I see patients, I like to have them add more healthy fats into their diet, and avocados is number one on my list. So it is important to look at how that food affects you when you eat them, right? Even some of these healthier options, but it might not necessarily be your healthiest option at the time.
Right, right. Another one is bone broth. There's this big kick for bone broth, but bone broth, the longer you cook it, the more time that it has histamine buildup. However, there are ways to reduce the histamine without eliminating it completely, because I don't like eliminating too many foods. I really like to add foods back. So instead of eliminating it, what you could do is use a shorter cooking time, especially in a pressure cooker, like an Instant Pot, to
Mhm.
really compress that time to be shorter. And then I can tolerate the bone broth much better.
Okay. And eating food as fresh as possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Very
It's
fresh.
really important to eat foods that are as fresh as possible. So people who, and I'm one of them, I have histamine issues, who love cheeses and olives and um, all sorts of fermented foods. If you find that you're adding, and again, we sometimes have people add fermented foods to their diet. And so if you find that you're having these reactions to adding fermented foods, then you might want to think histamine intolerance.
Absolutely. That's a great point. That if you are reacting to fermented foods and then you take them away, then that's actually a little bit of a test.
Right.
Uh, and that's one way I do test and we can go into that
Mhm.
later.
Yeah. So there are ways to recover from histamines, but we'll talk about that later. Is there anything else that you want to say about foods now that we're on that topic right now, before we move on to testing?
Sure. I think a lot of people have these histamine lists, and people are really sticking to these low histamine lists. And there's a lot of differences from one list to another, and so it's hard to find a list. There is a list. It's the SIGI list, SIGHI, and I have it on my website,
Mhm.
um, as well as I have a simplified version. But I think people really focus on the foods too much,
Mhm.
especially the whole foods. I think it's more coming from these ultra processed foods with the additives, these junk foods, and how we're eating. For example, if we eat at the same time every day and not too late, and we um, optimize our digestion by not watching TV or eating on the road while we're driving or being stressed,
Mhm.
and take our time and not overeat. I think a lot of that is half the battle.
Mhm.
Including another thing is avoiding really sugary foods. high blood sugar also is a trigger, and that is one of those vicious cycles. So
Mhm.
it's not just about avoiding the avocado, it's more about cutting out, ditching the alcohol, the processed foods, the high sugary foods,
Right.
the snacking all day, because every time we eat, a
Hmm.
little histamine is released for that digestion. So if we're snacking all day, then that histamine is constantly being released.
Right. Right. Yeah. So it's finding again a balance and removing some of the more toxic, like beer and wine, from, or
Mhm.
reducing those, not necessarily removing, but some people actually do should remove it completely because it's helpful to help heal your gut lining when you take some of these toxins out of your diet, at least temporarily until you've recovered. So, what testing is offered for histamine intolerance?
Well, histamine intolerance is really difficult to get the medical establishment to talk about histamine intolerance.
Mhm.
Savvy doctors like yourself are on top of it, but it's really hard for a lot of the traditional doctors to talk about it.
Mhm.
The MCAS, the mast cell activation syndrome, which is a huge cause of histamine intolerance, was only as an official diagnosis in 2016. But
Mhm.
histamine intolerance actually isn't a diagnosis. It's more like a condition or a syndrome that can tell you how to help or what the solution should be.
What the root cause is. Right?
And it's been ignored, largely ignored outside allergy, but I see a lot of people starting to really pay attention now, especially post COVID, with the link to high histamine and mast cells with the long COVID.
Mm.
So I actually have a self-test on my website with
Mhm.
the look at all the symptoms and the risk factors. And if you score over a certain amount, then at that point, I recommend trying three things. And
Mm.
one is a low histamine diet trial.
Mhm.
Trial meaning short term, not long term. It's difficult to get a nutritional balance on a really strict low histamine diet. Also trying antihistamines. There are a lot of natural antihistamines, including vitamin C, quercetin, which is a
Mhm.
bioflavonoid. And number three is trying a DAO enzyme supplement. So this is something you can take to support your own DAO level. And if you benefit from those, then it suggests pretty strongly that you have a histamine issue.
Mhm.
I From what I've seen, this could be more accurate than the actual histamine plasma testing, because there's been a lot of false negatives, meaning they will miss the diagnosis.
Mhm.
It's also things like genetic testing, which I've just had done and just had my results back, which are really exciting. I could talk about that later too. And then looking also, the last thing I will say is when you're doing the low histamine diet is to really keep a really detailed food log
Mhm.
of tracking what foods you're reacting to. And if our foods like spinach, citrus, bone broth, fermented foods, aged foods, things like that, then that's a pretty good sign that there's histamine there.
Mhm.
And then we go from there.
Right, right. What do you think about a different test called whole blood histamine in comparison to plasma histamine?
I'm not really familiar with it. But I look at the metabolite N-methylhistamine
Mhm.
because it's much more stable than histamine itself. The body doesn't want histamine around very long. It's very reactive, so it wants to be able to degrade it quickly.
Mhm.
But its metabolite is a little bit longer lived and it's easier to measure. But when you have blood histamine, they measured blood histamine, it's not telling you what's going on in the brain or the gut
Mhm.
or where the problem is occurring. So, whole blood histamine or plasma histamine, I think both can be really valuable as a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole story. I think you also need things like what's your level of DAO enzyme, um, and really the empirical test, which is cutting it out and seeing if you feel better, and then adding it back in, do you feel worse? And
Mhm.
things like that. And also antihistamines is a big clue. If you take antihistamines and feel much better, that's a clue that histamine is an issue.
Right. Yeah. And can you get a DAO level?
Yes, you can. There are labs that test it. One is called Dunwoody,
Mhm.
and I can't think off the top of my head the other labs, but yes, a DAO level in the blood is possible.
That's good to know. That's great to
Yeah.
know. So there are some things that can be done to sort of figure out this
Mhm.
puzzle sort of situation, because it does sometimes, even I, miss it because of just the way it presents itself. So it is something, like I said, having an index of suspicion about it and wondering. So the fact that you offer a quiz to try to figure that out is fantastic. So can you recover from histamine intolerance?
Well, yes, just take my boot camp. No, really, seriously.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
I'll certainly let people know how to do that. But what are some of the things that they can do at home right now?
Sure. Yes, I really do believe that you can recover. And my daughter is an example of that, where now she can eat almost anything but, ice cream. I don't, I don't have a lot of it around, but she can eat what she wants and not react anymore because we've really emptied that histamine bucket, is what we call. And I can talk about the histamine bucket. It's basically the accumulation of histamine from different
Mhm.
sources. So I really do believe people can. There's a diverse spectrum of severity. So people that have just a little bit of a problem when they eat something off
Mhm.
versus people that are reacting to any level of histamine or even just a little trigger. So that spectrum means that some people have a faster, easier recovery and some people don't. But everybody seems to get better because there are so many levels on which to heal. There's
Mhm.
lifestyle, there's environmental triggers, there's
Mhm.
food, there's so many things that you can do to
Right.
really support your system. So on many levels.
Right. There, so we've talked about the foods, we've talked about stress, and so obviously dealing with stress is learning how to meditate and stress reduction techniques and breathing can help reduce stress. Toxins. We've talked a little bit about toxins. The thing I think would be really great to talk a little bit more about is gut infections, because gut infections can act, or a dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of, I know you know this, but to let the audience know that it's an imbalance of good bacteria and bad bacteria that can result in your body's inability to release or remove histamines. It can actually shut down your body's ability to make DAO and HNMT enzymes to break down the histamines. So can you talk a little bit more about that and elaborate on that?
Sure, sure. Well, there are a lot of gut infections that can happen, and different bacteria can make histamine. And that will add to your histamine bucket, which is the accumulation, as well as whenever you have an infection or some imbalance, then the mast cells or the immune cells that are lining the intestine that are thinking, hey, there's something going on, and then they degranulate, which is release histamine in a big grenade-like fashion.
Hmm.
Um, so yes, that a lot of infections can cause that. Another thing is that when it damages that gut lining, the large portion of the DAO is made in the gut. So then you don't have what the histamine going out part anymore. So you have histamine coming in as a cause, histamine going out has been slowed, and you have the third complex one where you have the mast cells getting activated and releasing the histamine too.
Hmm.
So there's a lot going on there, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So would you have to get control of the mast cells before you got control over the histamines, or is getting control of the histamines calm down the mast cells?
The answer is yes, both.
Yeah.
Well, the the mast cells have a receptor for histamine, so they can be stimulated by histamine.
Mhm.
And then histamine is obviously released by mast cells, so they feed off each other. So it can be like a cycle. Um, you could Anything you can do to calm the mast cells and be an antihistamine would help. And an example would be taking a vitamin C with quercetin. Vitamin C is anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and an antihistamine.
Mhm.
And unlike the medical or the prescription antihistamines, which block the receptor but don't do anything about the circulating histamine, only just the receptor, which is basically plugging your ears to what's
Mhm.
going on, the vitamin C actually helps take the histamine out. So it's taking away. And quercetin synergizes with vitamin C by stabilizing the mast cell, also being an antihistamine and anti-inflammatory. So those two really work together well.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of other things you can do. It really depends on the cause. Whatever the cause is, then you would target that cause with the appropriate personalized healing regimen.
Right, right. And everybody has a different array of causes, which is why it's really pulling out each one of those drivers. Yeah. It's important to sit down and put your Sherlock Holmes hat on and figure out what it is for you specifically. Yeah. So great. That's such great information. And I'm glad that you have a boot camp because, I've worked with people and, we drilled down some of these issues with regards to histamine intolerance, but it really does take a deep dive sometimes, and working with someone specifically who really knows all of the variables, it really makes a huge difference. And I haven't had anybody to refer to when it comes down to that. And so finding providers that do this work is far and few between. So I'm so happy that you do this work and that we actually have somebody to refer to. So tell us more about your boot camp and how people can get in touch with you.
So first of all, I'm clearing my throat because this is a symptom of too much histamine, is the often throat clearing. The reason I still have it, despite all of the things I do, is because my genetics are very, very bent against having me have histamine. So what do? When people come in, we look at their cause and we play almost like a bingo because I want to make it interesting and fun.
Mm-hmm.
So if a person comes in and they have bloating with a high FODMAP food, say FODMAP is a lot of the fructose related types of foods, garlic, onions, some things like that. They have bloating to FODMAP foods, plus they have other signs of a certain type of gut imbalance, then we would focus less on some things and more on other things. And I'm not saying I diagnose necessarily everyone, but then I give them the tools and the knowledge to really go, okay, this direction, that's good, because people spend so much time and so much energy and so much money on supplements that don't work. And then I could point them toward the right probiotics. And then the wrong probiotics would make them a lot worse. And often things like the probiotics in yogurts will make them a little worse. So there's a kind of a pathway. I won't say it's a regimen that is very definite, but I mean, that's possible, but we really want to customize it to the person. Are they having also migraines? So that would mean a butterbur is a great supplement for that because it's a lot of evidence. It stabilizes the mast cells, and it's the evidence is a lot for migraines. So I like butterbur, and then also the right probiotics, like I said, as well as motility. To look at the motility, not just rebalancing the microbiome, but why is that SIBO or gut imbalance there? So really looking at what is upstream versus what's presenting now, what happened before. And then after looking at that, then the cause-based healing, we just walk through, and by the 4th week, they know what foods, they know what supplements are best for them. They've got a customized plan to just go forward. And I try to follow up with people that were really struggling, and sometimes it's simple, sometimes it's an easy fix, and sometimes it's a lot more intense. And so
Great. And how many weeks is the boot camp?
It's 4 weeks.
4
it's
weeks.
Once a week.
And is it a group setting or modules that people would do on their own or with you?
It is a group setting. It's live Zoom, and we go through, we do a food log. and they keep the food log, and I personally review it with them and say, hey, this may be a better thing. I really try not to eliminate foods, but what I try to do is say, hey, you know how you're reacting to these dried coconut chips? Well,
Mhm.
this is a huge trigger, but fresh coconut is fine. So that's a difference, is just fresh versus dried.
Mhm.
Or
Shooting,
could
right.
you, yeah,
Yeah,
or
a lot of dried fruits are high in histamine. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Well, this was fantastic. I'm so glad I finally got you on my podcast because I keep saying podcast, but it's a vodcast. I've been wanting to have you talk about this because it's such an important issue. So you've given us a great deal of information, and I will definitely provide my viewers all your information. But why don't you just let us know where's the best place to find you?
Mm. So my website, www.rider4health.org, has the symptom survey. See if you could have histamine intolerance. It has some information on supplements. It actually has a list of practitioners globally that recognize mast cell disorders as well as histamine intolerance.
Great.
And it has a little bit more information on the boot camp.
Excellent. That's so fantastic. So, Dr. Bev, thank you so much for joining me. It was so great to talk to you about this very important subject, especially because it can actually be a significant root cause for depression and anxiety, as you mentioned in a recent journal article that was talking about a study done on adolescents. So it's it's uh, it's just one of the root causes to look at for mental health issues. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much. It was so fantastic to have you.
Fantastic. And thank you also for inviting me. It's been wonderful
Great,
answering.
great.